We've all heard the terms trope and cliché used to describe certain elements within a film. They are usually used negatively and interchangeably, but is there a difference? Well, the answer is yes, hence this video. So today I want to explore a little bit more about what the difference is between a cliché and a trope, and how you can use these to make your story better, and what you need to avoid doing that will make your story worse. Clichés are elements, expressions, ideas, or actions that happen in very similar ways across stories and mediums. They are predictable, they lack originality, and often institute a state of boredom in your audience because of how overly familiar your readership is going to be with what happens when one of these is employed. For example, expressions such as "love conquers all" or
"I have a bad feeling about this"
are so common and simplistic that they lack depth and nuance. They express tired concepts in repetitive ways without introducing anything fresh. Plot devices such as "the chosen one" or prophecies often fall into this trap as a contrivance for the writer to move the story or to give importance to a character without too much effort. Or actions such as the damsel in distress or the brooding action star with a troubled past. On the surface, they may not automatically be bad, and I am going to explore how you can use them a little bit later on. But first, let's look at their counterpart, the trope, and what that is before we explore how we can use both of these more effectively in our own writing. Tropes are narrative devices, motifs, and storytelling commonalities that serve as recognizable patterns within particular genres or styles of story. Tropes are used to engage an audience's expectations, to introduce an element of the familiar that can help the audience understand where they are in the story and what sort of dynamics they can expect. Obviously, if these are overused, they can become clichés quite quickly, and that's a distinction we need to start drawing now. For example, the buddy cop trope is very common in investigative or action stories where two characters from different backgrounds are forced to work together. The forbidden lovers is another trope used in romantic settings. For storytelling, tropes can take the form of things such as the hero's journey for compelling someone to go on an adventure, or the fish out of water story for somebody stepping into a new world. We also get tropes for characters, such as the mentor or the tragic hero. These may seem like normal writing conventions, but there are a few things we need to be careful about to avoid our tropes turning into clichés. You may already be noticing the difference between the two, but let's use a few examples to illustrate the contrast and make it crystal clear. A character saying, "run away with me," to the star-crossed lovers is a cliché. Two lovers being star-crossed is a trope. A man losing his family and turning to drinking is cliché. A man losing his family and resorting to get revenge is a trope. The villain giving a monologue about their plan is a cliché, but the villain undergoing a redemption arc is not. So simply, the core difference between these is that clichés are isolated, individual actions or words. One situation, one phrase, one event that is set in the way that it's performed and done the same way in almost every iteration. It plays out, continues, and ends in the same way each time. A trope, on the other hand, is a convention of storytelling, and familiar, but it is flexible in how it's applied. It covers more ground and more time in the story to be realized, and is not isolated to one action or expression. That doesn't mean that tropes can't become clichés. They definitely can. The redemption arc of a villain can be cliched if they ask for forgiveness on their deathbed, because it becomes an isolated action rather than a process or a condition they've been exploring across their story. The point is that tropes allow for a great deal of flexibility. The hero's journey can be modified and presented in 1,000 different ways. The underdog story can play out in a whole variety of manifestations, and the exploration of forbidden love can take more forms than we can imagine. Clichés don't do this. They cannot do this. They are stationary and one-dimensional. They are easy cards to play from writers who don't know how to use tropes originally. But clichés do have a useful purpose and shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. By nature, being predictable and boring allows writers to more cleverly subvert the expectations of their reader by setting a situation up to be cliched only to produce something surprising. Elsa in Frozen is seen as empowering because rather than being a damsel in distress and hiding away in a tower, she subverts the cliché and essentially rescues herself. Leslie Knope in Parks and Recs is caught in a love triangle, but rather than creating a situation of spurned lovers, the show emphasized the emergence of respectful, meaningful, and mature friendships. A good exercise for any writer is to identify the clichés in their story and then experiment with subverting them. It won't always work, but it doesn't mean that clichés are useless. The opposite action should be taken for tropes. Feel free to use tropes, but don't rely on them. Some originality on your part needs to be injected into your application of the tropes, otherwise they simply become clichés. A mentor is a well-established trope, with an immense amount of value to a story, but having a wise old master who speaks softly but is secretly a badass isn't going to make your work seem very realistic. Indeed, that's quite cliched. Nor is having the trainee dominate the master and having them humbly bow down to their pupil in awe and reverence and realize how much they need to learn. No, that's also a cliche. Lionel Logue in The King's Speech is a great example of a mentor done differently, between two proud adult men who respect one another as equals despite their differences. Or how about the aggressive, pressure-filled mentor relationship between Miranda Priestley and Andy Sachs in The Devil Wears Prada? These are both the same trope of having a mentor, but they demonstrate how widely applicable that trope can be, and how we don't need to fall into the wise old master cliché. The final point here is that these standards change. Things that were once clichés fall out of fashion and can become original again. Tropes that seem standard can become repetitive in their execution if everybody does it. You need to stay vigilant with the originality you're employing. Are you doing something really different, or just something that's not as common? It's an important distinction that could be the difference between determining how well your work ages. So the writing rule here is to put effort into your originality. Clichés rear their ugly head when we become too lazy or complacent to put in the requisite amount of effort to create something that's truly original and unique, instead falling back on tired patterns that have been used thousands of times in other media and other stories. Don't be that person. Take time to subvert your audience's expectations away from clichés and put effort into making sure your tropes don't become clichés in return.